I'm excited to present our next speaker, Ron Hira. He is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute. He is also at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a professional engineer. He is the co-author of Outsourcing America, and he has testified numerous times, as many of our guests have, in Congress, and particularly on the current immigration reform legislation. I think you guys will get a very different perspective this afternoon from Ron, and it's my pleasure that he is able to present, most of all, some very new research that I don't believe has been seen before, so you guys can act a little bit as first eyes for some of this research, and I hope it will be very useful in your reporting.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Stephanie, for inviting me to this presentation, to this workshop. I've got a lot of slides. I'm not going to get through all of them. I think there's handouts that you can take a look at. But I have a stopping point around slide 17 or so, and I'll probably stop there. But as Laura said, I've got some new data. I just FOIA'd some data from USCIS, the Immigration Service, and so I have the actual I-129 records, the micro data for each H-1B that's been approved and denied by employer, by wage, by occupation, by also their education level. So I'm going to show some of this. You're the first ones to see this. Forward. No. There you go. 2 degrees in electrical engineering, and I don't know how to run this. That's why I'm teaching public policy. I try that.
So the other
Maybe
way
a little.
Go down.
Down, not up. Okay. All right. Stephanie asked me just very briefly to point out that there's lots and lots of different guest worker visas. These are not temporary, non-immigrant work visas, and I just pulled it right off of USCIS's website. You can see it's an alphabet soup of a variety of different guest worker visa programs, and I've just bolded a few just to point them out to give you a sense of the variety. So the E3 is certain specialty occupations from Australia. What is that? That's actually the H1B for Australians. So you, when the U.S. negotiated a free trade agreement with Australia, instead of folding it in guest worker visas into the free trade agreement, they did it on the side and they created the E3. And similarly, in the new Senate bill, there's an E3 category for Irish workers who have no more than a high school degree, which is kind of interesting. Then you've got ones that are occupationally oriented, like the registered nurse. You've got ones like the O1, which is for individuals of extraordinary ability or achievement. You've got some for religious workers down here. And then you've got some free trade ones like the NAFTA one here, TN. And that's important to keep in mind. There's a lot of these different ones. And in fact, there's a number that aren't included in this list, like the J1, summer work travel, cultural exchange, the OPT, which is for international students to work, particularly for STEM students, can work up to 29 months, not regulated, not capped or anything like that. But B1, where you're not supposed to work, but sometimes people do work.
Numerical cap, each one of these?
I'm going to get into that in a second. Some do, some don't. Okay, so I try to list some of the policy design attributes for different guest worker visas. So some have wage requirements, so they have really wage floors. For example, the H-1B has a wage floor, but the L1, which is commonly used also for skilled workers, has no wage floor, so you could pay home country wages with the L1. Some of them have caps. So for example, the H-1B has a cap of 85,000 plus a number of exemptions, so we end up with about 115, 130,000 new H-1Bs each year. But the L1 isn't capped at all. And by the way, I'm an expert on the high skill side of things, so I'm going to be sort of biased towards giving you examples here on the high skill side. The duration of stay, H-1B is 6 years. OPT, you can do 17 months of work or training, however you want to put it. 29 months if you're in the STEM field. Some of the guest worker visas have a recruitment and non-displacement requirement that you actually have to do some active recruitment of American workers first, and that you can't replace U.S. workers. Some do not have that kind of recruitment requirement. Who holds the work permit is important too. Harry talked about this a little bit. If the employer holds the visa, then obviously if you lose your job or you tell your boss to go shove it, you're out of status and you've got to leave the country. Now, realistically, a lot of people will transition to a temporary visitor status and then try to find another job, but you're still forced out, right? So that gives, I think, a lot of bargaining power to the employer. Dual intent, so this is important. So even though these are non-immigrant visas, some of them allow you to be eligible to go for a green card. Now, usually with the skilled immigrant visas like the H1B and L1, you do not self-sponsor. So you're dependent on your employer to sponsor you for a green card. And I'll show you in a minute that not all employers sponsor their workers for green cards. So as Laura said earlier, these are very important bridges to permanent immigration, to skilled immigration. The H1B is the major source for permanent immigration, legal permanent residence green cards. But that doesn't mean that all H1Bs end up becoming sponsored for green cards, and I'll show you some data on that. Portability is something that's been discussed in terms of the design of the policy. Most people are in favor of more portability for workers to move jobs and employers so that it's pushing away from the employer holding the visa and more like the worker holding the visa. Employers have been somewhat reluctant to allow that to happen for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. Okay? So what's some of the implications of this? There's sort of visa creep. I gave the example of the E3 for the Irish. There's also an E3 version for the South Koreans too. And some people have asked whether this is stealth immigration, sort of wide variety of different visas. We don't have a lot of good data on many of these guest worker programs. We actually have the best data on the H1B program, and it's actually not that great. But that's one of the reasons why there's controversy, because people can actually look at data and get a sense. For the L1s, we have no idea even what the annual flow of L1s is, because they have blanket petitions, for example. And so we don't know what they earn, what work they're performing, who really employs them, the geographic location of the employment, and the outcomes and output of those, both positive and negative, of these different workers. So I think that you have to take some of these studies with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of data slippage here, right? And there's a lot of unknowns. There's sort of dark visas, right? With the L1, we think there's about 300,000 workers here. With the H1B, even though we have good data, we don't know how many are here right now. We know what the annual flow in is. We don't know what the flow out is. They can stay up to 6 years. So there's various estimates about 650,000 workers. That's a pretty significant number. Okay. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so let me get into some data. So this is based on the I-129 data that I mentioned. So these are actual workers that have come in. So in contrast to some of the other data that's been presented, these are actual workers coming in. And what I'm showing is for fiscal year 10 to 12, the top 10 H-1B employers, and I could show you the top 20, and you would see a similar list. 9 of 10 of these firms are not the ones that you would expect, the Intels, the Googles, and so on and so forth. Instead, they're the offshore outsourcing industry. So these are all major companies, some based in the US like Cognizant, others based in India like Tata Consultancy, who are getting the lion's share of visas here. Cognizant got 18,000 H-1B workers over that 3-year period. And if you know their business model, what it is basically to try to offshore as much work as possible, do it in India. And for some of the work, it has to be done on site because it's geographically sticky. It's that home bias that Harry talked about earlier. And so they need to bring in workers, and because of the way the rules are set up, they can bring in those workers at below market wages, and so there's a big incentive. So what you see here is that the offshore outsourcing industry has really dominated at least the top use of the H-1Bs, and those top 10 got 65,000 visas over that 3-year period. That's about 25% of all the visas over that 3-year period. Just those top 10. If you did the top 20, it was 80,000 visas. So this is a very significant use of the visa program. Microsoft's the sole company out of this top 10 that doesn't do a significant amount of offshore outsourcing. You might be surprised that Accenture's here, but they essentially have the same business model as Infosys and Tata Consultancy. A company like Cognizant will have 150,000 workers worldwide. About 20,000 of them are here in the U.S. They hire almost no Americans. they're bringing in basically H1B and L1 workers to do the work that's on site, that's geographically sticky. And all of the other companies have the same business model, whether it's Accenture or even IBM is doing the same kind of thing.
Can you give an example of what some geographically sticky, what
Sure.
actual jobs are?
So these are usually in the IT services sector. So they're doing the IT work. They might be doing an ERP implementation, a software implementation, or something like that. And it requires face-to-face contact with the clients. And the clients are here. And in the case of Cognizant, it's based in Teaneck, New Jersey, right? Most of their clients are in Wall Street. So these are the large banks that are hiring Cognizant to do their software implementation, some design, customization, those kinds of things. And you need that physical proximity with the client to be able to service those folks. And instead of hiring Americans, what they do is they bring in the lower cost H1B and L1 workers to do that face-to-face work. And with the L1s, there's no wage floor, so we don't even know what they're being paid. I'll show you some wage data for the H1Bs. Okay, so one of the big confusions about the H1B program is it's often conflated in the press and elsewhere, even by experts, with green cards, that this is a permanent immigration. As I said, it's an important source for our skilled employment-based permanent immigration, but many employers don't plan on and don't sponsor their workers for, their H1B workers for permanent residence, for green cards. And so here I'm just showing you a chart. I pulled down the perm application, so this is the first step in the process of applying for a green card, so you can pull this right off of the DOL Department of Labor website. The total number of perm applications for H1B workers, Cognizant, about 12% of their H1Bs, they're applying for permanent residence. Tata Consultancy, you can see here, applied for a grand total of 0 permanent residents for green cards for their H1B workers. Even companies, like Accenture, they're at 0% because I'm not showing you the decimal point here, right? 27 of their 6,000 H1Bs, they applied for green cards. So this is an important distinction, I think, in the discussion. The guest worker visas, when they're used purely for guest workers, it's a labor market policy. It's not an immigration policy. It's why are we bringing these people into the labor market? There's got to be some reason for it because it's really truly for temporary purposes. And if you look at just the top 10, about 1 in 11 or so is the ratio that you get in terms of the perm to H1B. So I've made up this term immigration yield just to get a kind of a sense of how the different employers are using it, at least as a bridge to immigration. And you see some companies like Microsoft are applying for lots of green cards. So for most of their H1Bs, they're applying for green cards. So here I'm going to show you some wage data, and this is the actual wages, unlike the LCAs that's been used in the past. Because we've got the I-129 data, these are the actual wages that are listed on the petitions. And you can see here the median for the, and I've divided this up into offshoring firms versus product firms. The medians here are all in the 60,000s. IBM's an exception in part because IBM has multiple business lines. One of their business lines is IT services, the cheap labor IT services, but they have other business lines in research, software development, and semiconductors. So if I separated out IBM India, for example, that wage rate would be much lower. So you've got a median here, the Infosys at 60,000, right? And it turns out they're 10th percentile, 60,000, or 25th percentile, their median, their 75th percentile. That means about 5,000 of their H1B workers were paid exactly the same, $60,000 over a 3-year period. Does that look like a normal labor market to you? Like supply and demand, prices working? So what's magical about that 60,000? Well, Infosys is so-called H1B dependent because they're a heavy user of H1Bs. They are subject to additional regulations. They have to do active recruitment, so-called good faith recruitment, and also attest that they're not displacing workers, whether in their own firm. Of course, they don't have any American workers, so they're not going to displace any, but even in their client firms. And there's an escape clause, though, for those H1B dependent firms. They don't have to meet those additional recruiting and non-displacement restrictions if they pay their worker at least $60,000 a year. Ah, 60,000. Very interesting, right? Okay. So let's look at a couple of the product firms that are in the top 20. And so you see companies like Microsoft, Intel, Google, Qualcomm. And I've just highlighted a couple here, again, showing you the wage distribution. Microsoft got about 4,800 workers. Their median's pretty high at 95,000, right? But it's, it's higher, but not spectacular. The claim is that these are the best and brightest workers. The median wage for a software developer in Seattle, Washington, in their district is about 102,000. So these are good wages, but certainly nothing spectacular in terms of what they're paying those workers. Similarly, Google pays about 110,000 at the median. The median wage in San Jose for software developers is about 116,000. So again, these aren't spectacular wages for the best and brightest. It looks like pretty ordinary. Now, one would want to try to control for experience and other skills and all that. But look, they're going to be hiring across the spectrum here, and they're not hiring people at super high wages, as Bill Gates has actually publicly claimed a number of times that Microsoft pays $100,000 for these jobs. It's only when you get up to the 75th percentile that you're getting above $100,000 in terms of Microsoft itself. Okay.
Are the skills the same for these two groups? So,
What skills?
I mean, the people in offshoring firms versus the product firms. So, I mean,
They're going to be in
higher
different.
than
They're going to be in. I'm going to show you some education level, but they'll be in different occupations. So I didn't want to show you all the occupations because I thought it would be too much to try to go through all of those. But the IT services firms tend to hire a certain computer systems analyst. It's 1131. So I can't remember the SOC code, the standard occupation code offhand. Whereas Microsoft would be hiring software developers more likely, or computer information systems researchers. Okay, so you can look at some of the job titles to get a little bit more granular analysis there. So now let's look at the offshoring firms and see where their H1B workers come from. Virtually all of their H1B workers are from India. If you look at their new H1Bs received and the number from the top country, you can see that 99.6% of Cognizant's 18,000 workers come from India. Same with Tata Consultancy, Wipro, Infosys, and Accenture. These three companies, Tata, Wipro, and Infosys, are all, of course, Indian-based. Cognizant is not. Accenture, of course, is not. They're in Bermuda and an offshore tax haven, right? Does this look like bona fide recruiting to you when all of your workers come from one country? And remember, almost all of their workers are H1Bs or L1s, right? Now, if we look at the product firms, India also is a top source, but Microsoft gets about 30% or so of its H1Bs from India. And of course, their other workers aren't all H1Bs. Google is the sole country where the top source country is China, 22%. Now, for these other companies, if you're curious, the second top country would be China in all of those cases right there. Now let's look at the education. The sort of the poster child of the H1B worker is the PhD from MIT who's being shut out by the terrible H1B policies. The reality is that, at least for the offshoring firms, the majority hold no more than a bachelor's. So if you look at Cognizant, 81% of their workers have no more than a bachelor's degree. Infosys, 86%, and so on and so forth. So it's really about the bachelor's degree here, and you can even look at some of the occupations and things like that. Almost none of them are PhDs. We look at the product firms. Thanks. We look at the product firms, even Microsoft, and this really floored me. Microsoft, 62% of their H1Bs have no more than a bachelor's degree. Only about 4% have PhDs. Right? So the majority, again, are really on the middle end here. And I think that has some implications for us thinking about whether Americans can fill those jobs. And I would take maybe not exception, but I would disagree respectfully with Harry's assessment of the STEM labor market and the supply. I'll point you to how Salzman's work. There's a recent article in IEEE Spectrum by Bob Charette trying to look at whether there's really a STEM shortage from the native domestic supply. Okay, so let me wrap up quickly here and just point out a couple of things. High-skilled immigration is mostly employer-driven. It's not all employer-driven. A lot of skilled workers do come in through family means, through refugees and so on and so forth, so the other humanitarian and whatnot, other channels. But the ones that are employer-driven, the employer motivations matter a heck of a lot, right? You have to be really paying attention to what employers are doing. temporary guest worker visas are not the same as legal permanent residents, and the temp visa numbers are much higher than the green card numbers. And so that creates a huge bottleneck. I also point out that we've had this rise of shareholder value. A number of people have written about this, about the way that corporate governance and corporate norms have changed over the last few decades. Employment practices have changed. The way I put it is the fate of U.S. workers no longer figures in corporate decision-making, right? The CEO of Xerox or IBM is not compensated by how many U.S. workers they have, nor by how the U.S. economy does. It's by stock prices, right? And so they're going to do everything they can. If they can make more profit by substituting a foreign worker in for an American worker, they'll do it. And in fact, in Rochester right now, Xerox has outsourced its product engineering to HCL, which is one of the major offshore outsourcing firms. And I know the American engineers who are out training their foreign replacements are here shadowing them on H1B or L1 visas. So there is some direct substitution that goes on. Okay. The large wage differentials drive offshoring. This was a really disruptive business model that Cognizant and Infosys have. They're gaining market share. They're incredibly profitable. Their net margins are about 27%. That's the bottom line. In an industry where you would expect about 6 to 8% net margins, you were doing well. This is why IBM has shifted about 100,000 workers over to India to adopt that same business model, and has been shifting its workforce there. IBM has 112,000 workers in India. The average wage is $17,000 a year, and they're competing their Indian workers against their U.S. workers head-to-head through this. So there's a big drive for employers, and I'm not trying to vilify them. This is a rational response. Their rational response is to try to cut costs if they can, and they will, and they do. So I'll wrap up with these two last slides. There's no shortage necessary for an H1B. You can go out and recruit an H1B without hiring an American. You can directly replace an American with an H1B if you want. So all the discussion about surplus and shortage misses the point. There's no labor market test, to put it more technically. The employer holds the visa, and that you can legally pay below market wages. So this is something that's generally not understood, but the wage floor is set so low that it's fairly easy to pay below market wages. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Well, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, set the wage floor at the 17th percentile, and a lot of the policy discussion and fights were really about how much you could raise that wage floor. So Senator Durbin was trying to raise it to the mean, to the average wage, and the tech industry said, no, 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 no way. And so they got it basically a 20% discount. And if you talk to people that are inside the industry, Brian Keene, CEO, he used to be CEO of Keene here in Boston, they said, and they've been in the industry, they'll say you get about a 20 to 25% wage differential savings by bringing in an H1B worker. So if you talk to the actual executives who are in the industry, they'll tell you that in fact there's a wage saving. This is why it's going on. This is why Cognizant can hire 18,000 workers and they're all H1Bs, because they want to avoid hiring Americans, right? Because it's a lot cheaper.
17th percentile?
So the way the prevailing wage, that's the term of art that's used, is set, it's set based on the occupation code and the geographic region. So if you hired a computer programmer in New York City, you would expect that the wage distribution, the wage profile, right, how much you pay the top programmers versus the median versus the 25th percentile would be higher than in Rochester, New York, right? So when you go and calculate what the minimum wages that you have to pay, you pick the location and then the occupation code, and then you say, what's their experience level? Level 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the employer gets to select that. The lowest experience level is calculated by the Department of Labor at the 17th percentile of this wage distribution. So you can imagine the wages go up as your experience level goes up, right? The median would be higher than the 17th percentile. So you're on the tail end, the low end. And because the employer gets to select the level, is it any surprise that most of them select level 1? In fact, 54% of the applications are at level 1, which is considered an entry-level position.
It's because they're young. They are at the right experience level. They're all 20, 30 years old, so they
Sure, that could be an argument.
So that's the prevailing wage. That's not a 17th percentile. It's the prevailing wage for that experience, that occupation, and that city.
Well, you're using the term of our prevailing wage, but
Yeah.
it's calculated as the 17th percentile.
Of the whole, why do you want to put in 50 years old with 20 years of experience against these people who don't have?
That's a good question. So what should we set the prevailing wage at?
The right wage for the experience and the city and occupation.
Right, so these are the best and brightest, right?
Okay, I want to continue this, and I know we're going to have a group
So,
discussion.
So it's, I mean, it's just, it's set, it used to be set at the 33rd percentile. What should be the percentile?
Ron for question and answer.
Yes.
Let's do 10 minutes with of Q&A with Ron, and then we'll break, and then we'll
So-
come back for discussion.
So let me just show this one slide, because I think it's important. I've given you sort of the negative side of the H1B, right? And there are some very low wage jobs, and it's not just in IT, but advertising management, I thought I'd pick that one out, $24,000 a year. This is an actual approved petition for $24,000 a year for the best and brightest in advertising management in Columbia, Missouri. And then you have companies that are hiring, computer folks at $200,000 a year. So what I'm saying is that there's not much selectivity in this. But there are some of the best and brightest who are coming in through H1Bs, and so we should keep that in mind. So I just want to, I don't want to say that all of them are being underpaid, but a fairly large share are being paid below market wages.
Thank you. So stay up there.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to do Q&A, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to have a broader panel, and we will have more discussion on this. Can you, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm
It's
Tim
just-
Rogers, I'm a current Neiman Fellow here at Harvard. Does the discount, this 25% discount, extend to those who have managed to get a green card? And in theory,
Yeah.
they should have more leverage
Yeah.
to negotiate, but does the median wage increase for that group?
I haven't done that analysis yet. It would be hard to do that analysis because you can't really identify what they're being paid at once they get the green card. But certainly, basic common sense and economics would argue that yes, they would no longer be tethered to the employer and would have bargaining power and would be able to move. So I think that's right. Now, Lindsay Lowell, who's at Georgetown, has tried to make those calculations. I think his study's pretty old right now, but that's what he has found, is that once they convert to green card status, their wages do go up. So you do see a bump up.
They go up, is there still a discount, or they go up to competitive with
I-
geos?
So it's hard to disentangle because you're comparing these sort of broad categories, so you'd have to try to control for what their education level is and their occupation. And we just don't have the data at that kind of granular level to be able to do it. But I can put you in touch with Lindsay, or you can contact him yourself, and it'd be better to get it from the horse's mouth than from me on that.
So can you say something
Can you
about,
introduce yourself?
Mark Rosenblum from the Congressional Research Service? Can you say something about the degree to which the H1Bs who come in and do technology work, how much those jobs are vulnerable to being outsourced if those firms can't
Sure.
put people over here?
This is a great question because, of course, the industry always threatens you that we're just going to offshore the jobs if we can't get more H1Bs. That's a complete bluff, right? And it's a bluff for this reason. Because if they could offshore the work, they would have already done so, right? There's nothing stopping them. If they could save money by offshoring, they would do it. It would be crazy for them not to, and in fact, they are doing it. So those are geographically sticky jobs. These are jobs that require on-site presence. That's why they have to bring in the H1Bs, and I'll give you another example. Cognizant and Infosys have higher margins for their workers that they bill offshore. Their preference is to do as much work offshore as possible. They're offshoring as much as they can. This is work that has to be done on site. Now, a lot of people give the story of Microsoft, setting up in Vancouver. I interpret that a little bit differently. They set up in Vancouver. They didn't set up in Bangalore. Why did they set up in Vancouver? Well, if you've ever been to Seattle, and my actual brother and one of my co-authors teaches in Vancouver in Canada, it's not that far a drive, right? So you have the geographic proximity. Plus, they started bringing in those workers after a year on L1 visas. And so once they were plopped down in Vancouver and they could work for a year in Vancouver, then they started bringing them down, actually physical presence in Redmond. So I think that people have misinterpreted that story and the whole story about the offshoring, right? If they could offshore, they're already doing it as much as they can.
Can you expand? I didn't quite understand. Once they bring them to Vancouver, then what's the significance?
So the L1 visa is what's called an intra-company transfer. It's for multinational corporations. There's two variations, the L1A and L1B. But so that companies can't just simply hire somebody, let's say in India, or Toyota can hire somebody in Japan and bring somebody over right away. They have to work at least a year abroad in that company. It doesn't matter which country they lived and worked in, but they have to work at least a year for that company. And so in the case of Microsoft, they had those workers come into Vancouver, work for a year, and then they brought them over on L1s.
I'm Kate Hunter with Bloomberg. I wanted to see, in the Senate bill, I know it makes I know it makes a lot of changes to H-1B visas, but one of the changes, as I understand it, that was kind of negotiated during the Judiciary Committee markup was to add some new requirements for recruiting or recruiting domestically to try to avoid, I guess, the substitution factor. I was wondering if you might be able to explain those and also maybe comment on, how effective you think those would be or useful you think those would be?
Yeah, so a couple things. So the way the Senate bill tried to target the program was to say that the heaviest users would have to jump through some additional hoops, right?
Dependent employers, right?
Yeah, so and there's different thresholds. So 15%, like we have existing H-1B dependency, and then 50% you can't get any additional H-1Bs at all. Why would you have more than half of your workforce in the U.S. is the argument, right, on H-1Bs or L1s. So the additional recruitment requirements for everybody, including Microsoft, that's not at that 15% threshold, is basically to put the job on a DOL, Department of Labor website, post it for 30 days, and then they have to meet what's called a little good faith recruiting effort. I think you can meet those requirements and still avoid hiring Americans if you want. So you can game the system if you want still. And the offshore outsourcing firms have to meet some additional requirements, but they are not worried about that part of the bill, which tells me that, in fact, that they're going to be able to have some workarounds. Now, there was some stronger language in there where where the firm would actually have to hire qualified Americans if they found qualified Americans. And during that whole amendment process, Hatch basically put an amendment in that ripped that piece out. And so it's really watered down any kind of protections along the way.
I understand. So basically it went from being an actual requirement to hire these people that you find through this.
If you find qualified folks, yeah.
If you find them, it went from that
To-
the Hatch amendment process to.
You just have to advertise.
Okay,
And so as long as you advertise, you can hire whoever you want.
okay, thank you.
We know each other, Michelle Quinn, formerly with Politico. I have two questions. One is, first of all, my understanding is that the IT outsourcing firms are really scared about the Senate bill. It does stuff over to them long-term that basically destroys their business to the point where they're like, we may have to buy a US firm, or we may have to merge with, or maybe IBM will buy us, or, all that sort of tension because there's stuff in there. They're just praying that nothing happens.
Yes.
But then what I'm interested in is the layer of companies underneath that you got to: Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon. So it seems to me the wage is not the motivation for bringing in these workers. I mean, yes, maybe they're not paying the median wage in San Jose or Seattle, but there's something else. And it seems to me that may go to their argument that we are desperate for this kind of worker. And okay, so we might not be paying them $110,000, which we could pay in San Jose, but we can't find the guy we want or the gal in San Jose. Have you looked at, or has anybody looked at demand, supply in this area?
Okay, so let me deal with the first thing in terms of the Indian firms. It's not just the Indian firms, I should be careful, because it's been couched as Indian, it's not Indian. Cognizant was a spin-off of Dun & Bradstreet. It's a US-based firm based in Teaneck, New Jersey. It has exactly the same business model. What they're worried about is one clause, and that's the outplacement clause, that you can't basically rent out your workers or put a worker at a client site. Now, I interpret the language a little bit differently. It's called the outplacement clause, and so you can't place your worker at a client site. And the language is a little bit broader than the current L1 language, so it's not just a matter of labor for hire, but it's almost like a blanket sort of outplacement restriction. And so that's what they're definitely worried about, not about the recruitment or anything else. And there has been some discussion about whether, behind the scenes, about whether there's going to be some mergers and things like that. the interesting thing about all of that is that, that IBM and Accenture have the same exact business model, right? And, let me go back to this. IBM and Accenture have the same exact business model, but because they have other business lines and they have a lot more American workers, they're not going to hit that 15% threshold. So what the Senate bill will do is take some of the offshoring from Infosys and some of the contracts they would have won and Tata, and it'll shift it over to IBM and Accenture. So the politics of all this is kind of strange, right? So from a U.S. worker point of view and economy, it's not any different, right? It's just that IBM is going to be doing the offshoring instead of Tata. Now, in terms of the, whether Microsoft is using this or Amazon or for desperately, specialized skills, we have to take their word for it, right?
So no one's doing any look at supply
They don't,
chain?
they don't have to do any, they don't demonstrate any of that active recruitment, right? They just say that they do it. Now, from their point of view, what they want to do is probably have as big a labor pool as possible. And Microsoft can say, look, we can't find people and, there's systemic shortages. At the same time, it's laying off 5,000 workers, right? I mean, literally, Brad Smith testified that there was a systemic shortage of workers while Microsoft was in the process of laying off 5,000 workers. Why couldn't those workers get shifted over? Were there some really super specialized skills that these folks had that they were hiring, or were they younger and cheaper? I don't know. That's an open question, right? Because we don't have data, nobody's paying attention to or collecting the data on that.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'll turn to the audience, sorry.
Related to that question,